It was the kind of morning where the light hadn't quite decided to be anything but gray. Construction crews were rolling in for a day of work on a new motel off I-40 in East Knox County. They found a man lying in the gravel parking lot, half naked, bruised, his shirt ripped, cash scattered around him like confetti. They called it in, the police came. It would take hours before anyone would know his name. This is still unanswered. I'm Maya Ellison. Today, we're reopening the case of Robert Dennis Blair Adams. Blair, a 31-year-old from Surrey, British Columbia, whose death in July 1996 still feels like a puzzle someone shook and then forgot to put back together. We start, as we often do, with the scene. The body was found on July 11, 1996, at about 7 a.m. The man was naked from the waist down. His pants, socks, shoes were nearby. A fanny pack close to him held gold bars, coins, jewelry. Scattered across the gravel, roughly $4,000 in 3 different currencies: Canadian, American, and German marks. The autopsy later listed a severe abdominal injury that ruptured his stomach and led to sepsis. There was also a significant head wound and multiple cuts and scrapes, the sort of marks that read like a struggle. None of the money or the gold was taken. No one was arrested. No one was publicly named. People who knew Blair said he had been acting strange in the weeks before. Paranoid, agitated, telling friends and his mother that someone wanted to kill him. He emptied his bank accounts, quit his job, bought a ticket to Germany he never took, crossed the border into the U.S., flew to Washington, D.C., rented a car, and drove, inexplicably to his family, 500 miles south to Knoxville, Tennessee. He was last seen alive walking out of a hotel lobby at 7:37 p.m. on July 10. By the next morning, he was dead. It's a case that sits on my desk with a lot of little contradictions. And to help me think through what those contradictions might mean, whether Blair was fleeing a real threat or whether he was trying, tragically, to run from his own mind, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Ruiz. Dan is a forensic psychologist who consults on homicides and missing person cases across North America. He specializes in late-onset psychosis, paranoia, and risk behavior in adults. Dan, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Maya. It's a grim one. I read through the file you sent, and, the first thing that hits you is the contrast. A man carrying obvious wealth, yet found in a state that looks like a violent encounter. It's disorienting.
Right. Let's rewind and try to bring this back to human scale. Who was Blair before that week in July? He was born December 28, 1964, lived in Surrey, BC, worked as a construction foreman. People described him as reliable, hardworking. He'd fought an alcohol problem, but had reportedly been sober for about 2 years. So, on paper, ordinary life. Then, starting in spring 1996, things change. His mother, Sandra Edwards, later said he had wild mood swings and that he kept telling her, and sometimes friends, that people were spreading rumors about him. He told someone he was scared someone wanted to kill him. He stopped attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. At work, he left sites unsecured, which colleagues said was completely out of character. He became agitated and erratic. In short, something shifted, dramatically and fast.
Yeah, that rapid change is important. In my experience, when someone goes from functioning, a job, social contact, sobriety, to suddenly paranoid and agitated, you have to consider several possibilities. Substance relapse is one, but the toxicology here didn't show intoxicating levels. Medical illness is another, infections, metabolic disturbances, head injuries. And then there are primary psychiatric disorders, an acute psychotic episode, late-onset schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder with psychotic features. The chronology, the bank withdrawal, quitting the job, the frantic travel, is classic flight behavior in the face of a perceived threat.
And he liquidated his assets. On Friday, July 5, Blair went to his bank and emptied his safe deposit box, more than $6,000 in cash and thousands more in jewelry, gold, and platinum. He quit his job the same day. That is the first clear pivot to action.
Which tells us he believed the threat was imminent. People don't do that unless they're trying to disappear, or unless they think their life is about to be destroyed. The cash and portable assets are interesting because people who intend to harm others sometimes carry weapons or call in favors. But carrying valuables also suggests he wanted mobility. He wasn't preparing to blend into normal life. He was preparing to be on the run.
But then the journey gets strange. He first tried to cross into the U.S. at the Canadian border and was turned back. Border agents were suspicious because of the amounts of cash and valuables. Reports say he had evasive answers, and they suspected he might be involved in drug trafficking. He got denied entry. Then he bought a ticket to Frankfurt, Germany, reportedly for July 8th. He had a past connection to Germany, but he didn't get on the flight. He showed up at a female friend's house in a panic, left luggage in her driveway, then refunded the ticket. A day or two later, he successfully crossed into the U.S., likely through Washington State, reached Seattle, and then bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. He rented a car in D.C. and drove to Knoxville. The route makes very little sense if you think of it as a planned escape. It feels erratic, aimless, which could point toward a mind in crisis, or could mean someone was following him and he kept trying to shake them.
Exactly. Both are possible. When someone is being pursued, their choices can look disorganized. They're not trying to draw a map for anyone. They're reacting. And when someone is psychotic, choices are also disorganized because perception and reasoning are impaired. The difference often lies in other corroborating facts. Did the person report specific, plausible threats with details that can be checked? Did anyone else see signs of a stalker? In Blair's case, there's the repeated statement, "Someone's trying to kill me." But there's no corroborated person, no known dispute, no documented threats from an individual or group.
That's one of the cruelties of this case. Blair says the same phrase over and over in those final days. Someone wants to kill me. And then, days later, he's dead. It's the sort of coincidence that makes people assume his warnings were prescient. But from an investigative standpoint, the absence of a named suspect is a huge problem.
Right. And we should be careful to avoid hindsight bias. It's tempting to say, he said it, then it happened, therefore he was right. But our job, and in this conversation, my role, is to weigh probability. People in the throes of psychosis can make categorical, fearful statements that feel real to them. That doesn't mean there wasn't someone out there. It just means the statement alone doesn't prove external threat.
Let's take his last confirmed movements in Knoxville. He arrives the evening of July 10th, 1996. He stops at a BP gas station off Strawberry Plains Pike. At some point, he gets locked out of his rental car. The rental company is closed, and he becomes stranded. A tow truck driver takes him to a Fairfield Inn nearby. Security cameras capture him in the lobby between about 7 and 8 p.m. He goes in and out 5 times, pacing, looking over his shoulder. The hotel clerk later said he was paranoid and left the change the clerk tried to hand him. He paid in cash for a room, but the key card was never used. He left the lobby at 7:37 p.m. and likely never slept in that room. From 7:37 p.m. until the morning, when construction workers find him, there's a blank. Investigators estimated time of death somewhere in the early morning hours, maybe around 3 a.m. We don't know what he did, who he met, or whether he was picked up in a car. The body was found at a motel under construction just across the interstate from the Fairfield Inn, about a half-mile or so. It's the kind of place where truckers, locals, and transient folks pass through overnight. It's not a downtown area, but it's not isolated either.
Those hours between 7:37 p.m. and, say, 3 a.m. are where the most plausible interactions happen. If Blair was in a psychotic state, he may have been wandering, drawing attention to himself, or initiating interactions that, under normal circumstances, would have been harmless. If he wasn't psychotic and was instead being pursued, those hours could contain attempts to make contact with helpers, or escapes, or meetings. Unfortunately, the evidence on the ground, the physical scene, gives us some clues but not the whole picture.
Let's talk about the crime scene and the autopsy. The state of disrobing suggests someone else stripped him. Pants turned inside out, socks inverted, shirt ripped. There were numerous cuts and abrasions that investigators believed could be defensive injuries or from being thrown on the gravel. The head wound looked like it could have been from a club or crowbar. The lethal wound was to his abdomen, a hard blow that ruptured his stomach and resulted in sepsis. Toxicology reportedly showed no intoxicants at levels that would explain his behavior.
The abdominal rupture is a significant detail. It isn't a typical blunt force trauma that causes immediate massive hemorrhage. Rather, a focused, severe blow can perforate the stomach and allow its contents to leak into the abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis and then sepsis. It's a cruelly effective injury because it can lead to death over hours, not necessarily instantaneously. So if the time of insult was earlier in the night, he could have been alive for a while, but incapacitated and in extreme pain before succumbing.
Which raises the unsettling possibility. Did he lay there, fitting between consciousness and pain, in the gravel as vehicles passed? Did someone come back? Did someone find him and leave? Those are the small, terrible images that make this case so hard to stop thinking about.
And when we layer the presence of the cash and valuables untouched, the scene becomes even odder. If your motive is theft, you don't leave $6,000 in cash and a fanny pack full of gold. So many people look at that and say, then it had to be something else. But we must also consider human behavior in high-stress scenarios. An assailant might panic, flee, forget to take anything, or be interrupted. Or, alternatively, the dispersal of cash could be staged to mislead investigators.
Staged how? As if someone wanted it to look like a sexual assault or a robbery?
Potentially. There are several staging motives in homicide: to deflect motive, to shock, to create confusion, or to mask the relationship between victim and attacker. The half-naked state could suggest a sexual motive at first glance, but the autopsy didn't note clear evidence of sexual assault. That doesn't mean there wasn't some sexual context, but the forensic report points more to blunt force trauma and defensive injuries.
At first glance. And in this case, at first glance is one of the most dangerous phrases. The visual of a half-naked man in gravel with money everywhere is arresting. It fits a narrative. But the deeper readings of evidence lead investigators in different directions. Speaking of those investigators, Knox County detectives later said the case could be mental illness or could be foul play. They called it, quote, the most interesting and strange case they'd seen in decades. They kept it open, and to this day, it remains a cold case on their website.
It's worth emphasizing, too, that mental illness doesn't exclude the possibility of homicide. If he was psychotic, his behavior may have increased his risk of violent encounter. Psychosis can lead to social withdrawal, but it can also lead to disinhibited behavior, confrontations, or being in places where risky people are present. In the literature, people with acute psychosis are more likely to be both victims and perpetrators of violence than the general population, though the absolute risks remain low. The takeaway is, mental illness might explain his choices, but it doesn't explain the attack itself.
That's an important nuance. Now, there are several theories that circulate in reporting and in podcast episodes. One, he was in a psychotic break and wandered into a fatal altercation with strangers. 2, he was being followed or targeted by someone, perhaps related to his travels or past in Germany, and that person caught up with him. 3, it was a robbery gone wrong, though the untouched valuables complicate that. And 4, more fringe ideas, like an accident or bizarre misadventure. Let's take them in order. Dan, start with the mental health explanation. What patterns would support that theory?
Sure. The mental health explanation is supported by several things. Abrupt personality change over weeks, reports of paranoia and fearing death, leaving a stable life and liquidating assets, erratic travel decisions, buying and canceling flights, crossing borders, then heading in different directions. The CCTV behavior, repeatedly entering and leaving a hotel lobby, scanning the doors, is very consistent with someone who feels watched or is hypervigilant. Hypervigilance and persecutory delusions lead to avoidance and flight behaviors. Age fits too. Onset for some psychotic disorders like schizophrenia often occurs in the late 20s to early 30s for men. Combined, these facts make an acute psychotic episode plausible.
But plausible doesn't equal proof. There's no formal psychiatric diagnosis in the records, correct?
Correct. And that matters. Without clinical interviews or documented prior diagnoses, we're inferencing from behavior. Many people experience similar stress responses without a psychotic disorder. But the breadth and intensity of the symptoms, the financial liquidation, the travel, the specific fears of being killed, push this toward an acute psychiatric event in the probabilistic sense.
Now, the alternative. He was being followed or targeted. People who knew Blair sometimes say, but he kept saying someone wanted to kill him. Who are we to say that wasn't real? What would investigators look for to prove that sort of pursuit?
Investigators would hope to find corroborating evidence, phone records showing threatening calls, friends or acquaintances who saw or knew of a stalker, patterns of surveillance, physical evidence like vehicles seen at multiple locations following his path, or someone with motive, financial, personal, criminal, to harm him. In Blair's case, none of that materialized publicly. Border agents flagged his cash and sometimes suspect involvement with drugs, but no follow-up evidence tied him to a trafficking ring. If someone were pursuing him for reasons unknown to family, that would be harder to prove, but you'd still expect a trace, a phone number, a flight booking that matches another person, eyewitnesses, and the public record doesn't show those.
It leaves this gnawing question. Did the person Blair feared exist? Or did the fear itself become the driver? Another thing that sticks in people's craws, the money. If it wasn't stolen, why was it strewn around? There's the staging theory. How would staging look in a homicide? And how would investigators detect it?
Staging can take many forms. An assailant might deliberately remove clothing, scatter money, or leave items to suggest a motive that isn't real. Investigators look at the sequence of events, what items are missing versus present, trace evidence like fibers or DNA under fingernails, whether the victim's clothing shows evidence of a sexual act, the placement and condition of objects, and witness timelines. In Blair's case, the turned inside-out socks, inside-out pants, and ripped shirt suggest an external force or an altercation. But staging could also occur after a crime. A panicked killer might pull off clothing or toss items to obfuscate the cause or motive.
And the autopsy report, which emphasizes the defensive cuts and the head wound, leans toward a violent altercation rather than a staged suicide or accidental death.
Yes, the combination of defensive wounds, a significant blunt force to the head, and a focused abdominal injury points to assault. Accidents can cause similar injuries, but the pattern here suggests a physically engaged assailant, hands-on, a struggle.
There's a detail I want to linger on: hair found in his hand. Some secondary reports say he had hair in his fist, which could indicate he grabbed an attacker. Not every source confirms that detail, but if true, it's a powerful image.
It is. If he was able to grab hair, that would suggest he confronted someone close enough to be within arm's reach, not a distant thrown object. It could point toward a fight in close quarters. But again, we have to treat that carefully because it's not universally documented in the primary autopsy summaries we have access to.
Understood. Let's talk about motive, or the absence of one. The classic motives, jealousy, money, revenge, sexual assault, don't neatly fit because money was left. Was there any evidence of a previous dispute or contact in Tennessee, or with people linked to his travels?
No confirmed evidence. That's why some detectives lean toward the mental health route. No enemy, no argument, no debt collectors, no love triangle. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There could have been an unknown contact, someone from Germany, or a person who tracks people across borders. It's less parsimonious, though. It requires an extra entity we can't demonstrate. Occam's razor sometimes guides people towards psychological explanations because they fit the available facts without inventing more variables. But Occam's razor isn't a law, it's a heuristic.
There's also the human side. His family, his mother, said he wasn't himself. She tried to get him to open up, but he kept saying, "I don't think I should tell you about it." He refused to say what he was afraid of. That image of a son keeping a secret from his mother, it's heartbreaking.
And it's telling about how shame and paranoia operate together. If someone believes they're threatened, they may avoid telling loved ones because they fear it will put them at risk, or because their delusions convince them the danger is unspeakable. In clinical practice, loved ones often report abrupt withdrawal and secrecy when psychosis begins.
Let's move toward the endgame, the killed but not robbed scene. Do you think the assailant fled without taking valuables? Or do you think the scene was staged to send a message?
Both are plausible. If the assailant panicked, saw headlights, heard someone approaching, they might flee, leaving everything. If they staged it, the message might be intended to mislead investigators about motive or to humiliate the victim. Without motive, staging ideas often point to someone who wanted to complicate the investigation.
One of the enduring curiosities is Blair's Germany ticket. He had contacts there, had worked there before. If he was trying to flee, why cancel that flight? Why then end up in Knoxville? Is there any sensible explanation for the southern route?
Only speculative ones. He might have intended to go to Germany and then decided he couldn't. He might have received a new piece of information that made him change plans. He might have been trying to avoid a particular border crossing. Or he could have been following a delusional logic about where the threat was or wasn't. Humans under stress make nonlinear plans. It can look chaotic to outside observers.
We should also acknowledge the work that people have done to keep the case in the public eye. Unsolved Mysteries featured Blair. Multiple true crime podcasts have revisited the files. In 2017, local press revisited the case, hoping publicity might surface new leads. Detective Jimmy Jones called it the strangest case he'd seen in nearly 40 years. Yet, decades later, it's still open.
And that's crucial. Publicity sometimes generates tips. People move, memories resurface. Someone who was a trucker that week might recall seeing a car with a license plate. The cold case could be solved by an eyewitness coming forward. We see that happen enough to keep hope alive.
If anyone listening heard or saw anything that night in July 1996 in the Strawberry Plains/I-40 area, a car, a voice, a movement, please contact the Knox County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit. Their details are on their website. We'll put that contact information in the episode notes.
Maya, before we wrap, I want to address one thing we haven't yet said aloud: how we talk about mental illness in true crime narratives. There's a tendency to conflate psychosis with violence in public discourse. It's stigmatizing and, frankly, wrong more often than it's right. The majority of people with psychotic disorders are not violent. They're more likely to be victims. When we discuss Blair's possible psychosis, let's do it with compassion and nuance.
Absolutely. Compassion is central to how we tell this story. Blair was a man with friends and family, a job once, a life people remember as ordinary. Whatever his final days contained, fear, confusion, or a real threat, he deserves to be remembered as more than a sensational headline. That said, do you personally lean one way or the other, Dan? If you had to give me a probability, purely your clinical take, would you place more likelihood on him being in a mental health crisis that increased his risk, or on the idea that he was being actively hunted?
If I must hazard a probabilistic judgment, I would say the most likely scenario is a combination. Blair probably experienced an acute psychiatric crisis that prompted the erratic travel and fear. That state increased his exposure to risk and likely led to an encounter with one or more people that turned violent. In other words, mental health crisis explains the vulnerability in behavior. Homicide explains the mechanism of death. Without direct evidence of a pursuer, the being hunted theory is less parsimonious. But, and this is key, it's still possible.
So, the story that best fits the available facts is not a single, neat explanation, but an overlap, a mind in crisis intersecting with violence. It's tragically plausible. Let's give listeners some concrete takeaways from the investigation itself. What were some of the key investigative dead ends or missed opportunities that, with new technology today, could be helpful?
Good question. First, DNA technology has advanced tremendously since 1996. If any trace evidence, scan cells under fingernails, hair, fibers, blood, was preserved, modern forensic labs might extract DNA profiles that weren't recoverable 20-plus years ago. Second, old phone records or travel records could be reanalyzed. Third, public appeals with audio or refreshed images sometimes jog memories. And fourth, re-interviewing witnesses with new context can uncover inconsistencies or leads.
Do you think there's value in reopening the case publicly, or does publicity sometimes muddy the waters?
Publicity is a double-edged sword. It can surface witnesses and jog memories. It can also generate misinformation and unhelpful speculation. The ideal is targeted publicity. Present facts, ask specific questions, and provide reporting channels. That invites useful tips without spinning wild theories.
Which is, ironically, what we tried to do on this show, provide a careful retelling without sensationalism. Before we close, I want to read a short passage from a statement Blair's mother gave, not as evidence, but as a humanizing anchor. She said he was not himself, that he kept saying, "I don't think I should tell you about it." She never found out what it was. That line has haunted reporters and listeners for years.
It's haunting because it suggests the distance that can grow between loved ones and someone in crisis. We see it often: secrecy, shame, fear. It leaves families with unanswered questions that are wounds in themselves.
So, where does that leave us? We have a man who abandoned his life, emptied his savings, moved like someone fleeing, or like someone losing the ability to plan. We have a final night that reads like a human scramble: keys locked, a cash payment for a room he never used, pacing in a lobby, and then a gap of hours. We have a body that shows the violence of a close struggle and a death that wasn't instantaneous. We have valuables left behind. We have no named suspect. Decades later, it's still unsolved.
And because we don't have the missing pieces, we have to be humble in our conclusions. We can suggest probabilities, highlight the forensic evidence, and contextualize behavior with psychiatric knowledge. But we can't and shouldn't replace the facts that haven't been found. The uncertainty is, in some ways, the most honest place to end.
Honest, yes, and sad. Before we go, a few notes for listeners. If you have information about Blair Adams's movements in East Knox County on the night of July 10/11, 1996, please contact the Knox County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit. We'll put their contact info in the episode notes. If this episode stirred up something personal for you, memories of confusion or of a loved one with paranoia, please consider reaching out to local mental health resources. You don't have to carry it alone. Dan, thank you for your thoughtfulness and for helping pull the psychiatric threads into focus without reducing Blair to a diagnosis.
Thank you, Maya. And to your listeners, remember that cases like this are about humans. Compassion matters. Evidence matters. And sometimes the two must be held together.
On our next episode, we'll look at another cold case. Different facts, same ache. A life cut off and a family waiting for answers. If you found this episode meaningful, share it with someone who cares about unsolved cases. Follow Still Unanswered on your favorite podcast app, and if you want to help us keep digging, consider supporting the show. For Blair Adams, and for the countless others whose stories stay half-told, I'm Maya Ellison. Thanks for listening. This episode was produced by Still Unanswered. Additional research was drawn from public records, archived reporting, and the Knox County Sheriff's Office cold case listings. If you have a tip, Knox County Sheriff's Office. Again, contact information in the show notes. Good night. Good night.